it was a domino effect, and it was crazy how this one little thing I started, it started to kind of branch out and connect to other Bears fans. Who knew that one answer to that one question as a first grader catapulted me into this like huge obsession? And there's this kind of stigma with women that they don't know as much, or they're not as knowledgeable about the game.
Welcome to another episode of Not Your Average. I'm one of your hosts, Alexis, and today we have another wonderful guest for you. Katelynne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katelynne. So I host a podcast basically discussing everything involving the Chicago Bears. It's called the Bear Down Girl Podcast, and I do that. Right now it's only once a week, but it'll pick up this season. I'll do it twice a week.
Awesome. So first we're going to start before you created the podcast.
Passions and podcasts. So I started my full-time job in 2017 at the beginning of that year. And I guess I was just trying to get used to that job first. And then once I felt comfortable in that position, I'm like, what am I doing? I have this big passion of mine that I wanted. Like, I got this broadcast journalism degree. I was passionate about having a career in that because of my love of the Chicago Bears. You know, being a huge fan of them, it made me want to get into sports broadcasting, learning about the game, over the years, just becoming an expert on the game. And so combining my knowledge of the game and the team, and then my broadcast journalism degree, I thought, what can I do? How can I, there's different avenues. Do you want to do like a YouTube show, or do you want to do a podcast or whatnot? And for me, when I was in college, I really loved radio. I loved the audio side of it. There's TV and then there's audio. I really loved audio. So I thought, okay, let me figure out all this technology stuff, get all the equipment I need. And so basically that was the first plunge. Just get all the things you need, the microphone, a great, laptop. For me, I got a MacBook because I felt like that would be best suited for a podcast. So kind of by me investing in this, it's like, okay, now you got it. You spent your money on this stuff, so you better do this. So it's kind of little baby steps. And then I think getting it started was the hardest part, setting it all up, figuring out how to set up a podcast. There's a lot that goes into it. And so once I got the idea to do it, I was just like, you know what? I need to stop overthinking this, just go for it. And so I started it. And mainly the way I got it out to the public was through Podbean and iTunes, and I would just tweet about it. And more, I think through my following people on Twitter who are also Bears fans, they started to catch on about it, and I got listeners, and then those listeners kind of like shouted me out, and then got me more listeners, and it was a domino effect. And it was crazy how this one little thing I started, it started to kind of branch out and connect to other Bears fans. And it was, I don't know, it's kind of a fulfilling experience.
And when you decided to make a podcast, did you always know it was going to be about the Bears, or did you have other topics in mind?
It was always going to be about the Bears. I am, as my background shows, I have all these Chicago Bears signs, and I'm an obsessed fan, and I always knew that my dream job would be covering the Chicago Bears, talking about them, breaking down this team, discussing them in, ever increasing detail. And so that was never a question what it was going to be about. I was always it was just about like, okay, how would I, or like, what would be my, like, how would I cover them? Basically, would I go like hard news, like, or would it just be about me analyzing the team, having fun? It was just kind of like, okay, I'm going to talk about them, so let's just figure out like a design of like how this podcast is going to go. But it was never a question. I was always going to do a podcast about the Bears. And
you're from Pennsylvania, but how did you become a Bears fan from, they're all the way in Chicago?
Yeah, it's a funny story. So my older brother and my mom, when I was younger. They're both Steelers fans. You know, being in Pennsylvania, you kind of like, in the area where I grew up, I was born in Gettysburg. So in that area, it's kind of like a lot of Steelers fans, not really a lot of Eagles fans. So they were Steelers fans. And I just remember this one childhood memory I just could not forget. It stuck out to me, is when I was like around first grade, which is kind of full circle because my daughters just finished first grade. So here we go, full circle. When I was in first grade, my older brother asked me what my favorite football team was. And, you know, as a first grader, like, this is what you think of. I said, well, I like the Bears because I like bears, like the animal. And who knew that that one answer to that one question as a first grader catapulted me into this like huge obsession. And it wasn't until like I was like in 2005, geez, I was like maybe 12, gonna be 12, 11, 12. It's around like fifth grade. I decided to really start watching the team more. I always kind of was like, oh, I'm a Bears fan, but I didn't really pay attention being a young kid. And it wasn't until then I really started to pay attention to the team and watch them, and I continued to follow them. And it's weird because growing up in Pennsylvania, most of their games wouldn't be on TV because they would only play like the local teams. And so it wasn't, I really didn't get to see them on TV a lot. So I'd have to follow like on my computer. I would watch the games online, and that's how I'd follow them. And just year by year, the fandom kept growing and growing and growing. And then as I got to high school, I was like, I kind of want to make a career out of this. And so it became, you know, kind of like a thing where it's like, okay, I want to get a broadcasting degree. I want to be a sports broadcaster. I'm going to cover the Chicago Bears. It's just this one little thing where that's how I became a fan. And all of a sudden it kind of gave me my whole life path.
Oh, that's great. Just a random answer as a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you converted any of your other family members to be Bears fans? Is your daughter a fan?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's like, I've tried to like, that'll be that's been our bonding experience, is her being a fan of them as well. And, you know, as she gets older, she gets more, you know, independent and has a funny personality, and she's, you know, very smart. So yeah, she follows the team as well. My mom, she's kind of just the supportive mom, and she's like, I know you love the Bears, so anytime they're on TV, I'll root for them as well. So it's kind of like, basically those two, no real other people. I guess some people, when it comes to their football teams, they're pretty strong about who they root for, and they don't really change that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. What does
Yeah.
your mom do when there's Steelers and Bears are playing?
She always says she roots for both. Because she has other players, like she's kind of like a more casual fan. She doesn't have like a hardcore team she roots for. So she'll root when she sees the Steelers, she'll root for them. But if the Steelers and Bears are playing, she'll kind of just like root for both of them. I think she knows how passionate I am. She might be leaning towards rooting for the Bears because she knows if the Bears lose, I'd be really upset. So I think part of her is like, oh, I better root for the Bears.
That's fair. That's fair. So, how has the podcast evolved over time? Like now you're over 200 episodes in.
I think how it's evolved, it's kind of like it's grown slowly. I think these past 2 seasons, it's really like kind of picked up in terms of like people listening and being involved. It's become more and more popular, where now it's like, if you want to see what the top like 20 Chicago Bears podcasts are, I'm like number 12, and I'm just like, what? This is crazy. I'm just this small town person from Pennsylvania, and all of a sudden this is becoming a popular podcast. So it's kind of like the fan interaction, connecting with a bunch of people on mostly through Twitter, and also just me personally getting as I go along, I realize, okay, this works for me, this doesn't, this is how I want to do the podcast. It's just kind of, I learn as I go. And I'm a big podcast listener, in general. I listen to a ton of podcasts. It kind of helps me grow as a podcaster, how they do their podcast, and think, okay, I like what they do there, or I don't like what they do there. And so I'm just constantly learning and trying to evolve. I try not to stay, linear. I try to constantly change the podcast so it becomes almost new and inventive all the time. So I'm constantly trying to switch it up and make it better.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm not really a football fan. My family's more into like baseball and stuff.
Okay.
But what has been like the best moment for you as a Bears fan? Like what was the best game that you ever saw, or like the highlight of a season or something?
I think just as a fan, I have like two different experiences. So one is a podcast. What was my favorite game or moment to podcast? I have that. And in general, first I'll talk about in general as a fan, my favorite moment was when back in 06. So this is when I'm really like starting to pay attention to the Bears and they make the Super Bowl. And in the Super Bowl game, for football fans, if they listen to the, like any football fans listen to this, they'll know this name, Devin Hester. He is like one of the best kick returners like to ever live. He holds like all the records, and that was his rookie season with the Bears. And he took the opening kickoff of the Super Bowl. They first kick it off, he gets the ball and he immediately takes it back for the touchdown. And I cannot forget the memory of me. I was up in my bedroom. I had my own TV in my bedroom. I was watching the game by myself and I start jumping up. Excited. I run down the stairs and like my brother and my stepbrother and my parents, they're in the living room kitchen and I'm all like freaking out, getting excited. And they're all like looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, why are you so excited? And so that moment has stuck with me. That was like kind of like a huge, like amazing moment. Unfortunately, they ended up losing that game, but that moment was still one of the best moments ever. But when the podcast, I think it was crazy how like when I started the podcast in 2018, up to that point, the team wasn't that good. They just hired a new coach. And then that year they went on this magical like year where they went 12-4. They went to the playoffs and just being able to like podcast about them making the playoffs, which was like the first time in like 8 seasons. So like 8 years. And that was like an amazing feeling. It's like, wow, I almost feel like I'm the lucky thing. Like once I started the podcast, I started winning again. And so it's just exciting to kind of like talk about them finally being this great team and then being able to share that with other fans and us kind of like bonding together over that. That was a pretty cool moment.
What's it like being kind of a fan when a team isn't doing well? How does that feel, especially when you're not like in a city that roots for that team?
Yeah, I'm a pretty passionate fan. I'm also like an optimistic fan. I never try to let them, if they're struggling or losing, I never try to let that affect my mood. I try to always be the optimistic fan, and no matter what, I'll still think they're going to win it every week, even though in the back of my head, I'm like, they're probably going to lose this week, but I'm still going to root for them to win. So I never let my, optimism go away about the team. In terms of, trying to do a podcast when the team's struggling, it's hard because, if you want to get listeners, sometimes fans they don't want to listen to anything if their team's not doing well. So it's almost like it's better for the podcast if they're winning, because then more people are going to want to listen and hear great things about the team. So if I'm thinking about that way, it's hard that way because it's like, I'll probably lose listeners because they're like, well, this team's not doing well. I don't really want to listen to anything about the Bears right now.
And how do you keep yourself, I mean, obviously you still release episodes during the off season, but like how do you kind of keep yourself hyped during the off season, and then what's the on season like? Is it a little bit stressful sometimes?
Yeah, in terms of, well, for the off season, how I manage it is there's kind of like different stages of the off season. For the NFL, it's evolved so much where it's an off season, but there's always so much going on. There's the NFL draft to cover and free agency where players are signing with new teams and, training camps. So I kind of like organize it and plan it out that way. It's like, okay, like this month is going to be all about this, the draft. Next month, it'll be about, okay, they're releasing the schedule. Let's break down this. So it's kind of like me over the years kind of picking up, okay, this is kind of the schedule, how I'm going to go about. So every off season, it's kind of like, I know what I'm going to do, what I'm going to talk about. I keep it pretty organized. So people know it's like, okay, this time of year, I'm expecting that kind of topic to be discussed. Of course, if anything big happens, I'll discuss it. But so that's how I manage it that. And yeah, in the off season, I only drop an episode once a week. So it's more casual. But yeah, during the season, it picks up. I do 2 episodes a week. I do an episode before the game, previewing it, what I want to see in the game, and then after the game ends, like a couple days later, I'll release an episode recapping the game. So it picks up where I'm dropping 2 episodes a week. So it does add a lot of like work to me, and especially me, I'm a big note taker. I organize and jot down everything, every little thing I do. I try to, because when I release the podcast, I want to make sure I'm giving factual information, like kind of thinking about my journalism, the journalism side of me, where it's like, I want to make sure I'm always giving out like, good, accurate content where I did my research. So there's a lot of time that takes into doing notes. And when you're kind of trying to recap a game, I recap every little thing about the game. So it's like notes are just like a big part of it as well. Recording it isn't one thing, but then just trying to prepare your notes, it takes up a lot of time during the season. It's my favorite part. I love talking about the games, but it is a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. How long does it usually take you to produce an episode?
So I always record my podcast through GarageBand, and the GarageBand is like super easy when it comes to editing and stuff like that. It's, even though I have an editing background, I took classes in college, so I already have that experience. But just for anybody who maybe didn't get that kind of experience or doesn't have a degree in that kind of stuff, they could still do it through GarageBand because it's pretty self-explanatory and how to record and stuff like that. And I can edit. I always edit as I go along. If I mess up somewhere or I'll record over something, I never I'm kind of one of those people. It's just like, I almost like record it live, basically. Whatever I say then, it's going to end up on the episode. I don't really cut out too much unless something sounded bad or I have to like edit out a background noise. But it's, I kind of always stick with that like motto, where I don't try to like over edit it. I just kind of let it be me, because it's just me being myself, and people are going to like it or not, but it's like, I don't want to over edit myself. So I try to, that saves me a lot of time. I don't spend too much time on editing, because if I prepare myself with good notes, I don't have to do that much editing. So in terms of producing it, it's actually pretty simple. It's just basically record it, upload it and stuff like that. I'll listen through it just to make sure everything sounds good. It all came out well, the audio, but otherwise it's not a whole big process. It's almost like the pre-podcast is more of a process, trying to prepare my notes, but actually producing it, it's not that much. For anybody who wants to get into doing a podcast, it's, there is a simple way of doing it, and you don't have to feel like, oh my gosh, there's so much that goes into it. It's like, there's a way where you can simplify it for yourself, so it's not so like stressful.
Yeah, that's good to know. GarageBand is super easy to use. I used it in a few class assignments and it was nice.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before when you were looking for broadcast journalism jobs that you didn't necessarily like how women were treated in it. Have you noticed that in the podcasting world, in the sports fan world at all?
It feels like for me, trying to like actually get people to buy or just like to invest in the podcast, listen, it felt like it's been a slower process. You'll see, I'll see guys start a Bears podcast, and they've just started it, but they've already got like thousands of fans and listeners. It's just because like, oh, like there's a guy doing a podcast about the Bears. Obviously, he probably knows what he's talking about, so I'm going to listen to it. And it feels like there's this kind of stigma with women that they don't know as much, or they're not as knowledgeable about the game, and which is crazy because I think sometimes women know more about the game, and because me, as like I said, I listen to a ton of podcasts, and I'm one of those people. If I hear something, it doesn't have to be about the Bears. It could be about if someone's talking about one of my favorite TV shows, and I'm like, that didn't happen, or that's not right. I'm one of those nitpickers where it's just like, when I hear somebody say something that's not correct, it kind of bothers me. It's like, did you guys do your research? And it's a little frustrating when you see, a lot of men who make podcasts in particular about the Bears, and it's like, they don't really have to do anything. People will just want to listen no matter, just automatically. And for me, it's just like, I had to like earn my spot. I had to like get people to buy in. And like, that's why, I chose the avenue. It's like, hey guys, I'm a woman and I know the Chicago Bears, and that's basically going to be my little, my spot where I'll claim where, because there wasn't really any other women who were dropping Chicago Bears podcasts. So I felt like I had my own little path to go on where nobody else is doing it. It was just trying to get people to buy in, and it's tougher. It's just like, I actually don't face that much, backlash to my face where it's like, attacking me for being a woman or anything like that. It's almost like subtle. It's kind of like where, I don't know, like I said, it's hard for people to invest in the podcast and get fandom, because I think there's just some kind of like stigma when it comes to women in sports.
Do you think, since you've been a fan for so long, has that always been the case? Like in high school when you were a fan, did like boys say, do you really know your stuff? That kind of thing?
It's almost like I always knew I was different in that way, where I don't think I knew. I was just this quiet girl in high school where I kept to myself, and I would hear guys would start talking about like certain things that happen in a game or a football game. And in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know all about this. I want to talk about this, but I would be so shy about it because it's almost like I knew if I spoke up, no one would really like take me seriously. And it's kind of sad where it's like, I already have that kind of like feeling. I don't even know where it came from or how I came to think that. It just maybe just seeing that no other girls kind of like the things I liked. And I was kind of, I'm not necessarily a tomboy. I guess you could say my interest might be more, I wouldn't say sports is I don't want to gender stereotype and say sports is like a man thing, because it's not. It's so much different than that. So many women are big fans of sports and football. But it just, back then, it just felt like, also the high school I went to was not as inclusive. And so it just felt like I wouldn't be accepted. I was always that way in high school. It was very like, it was kind of stereotypical cliquey in my high school. And so I always felt like super nervous to even say anything. And and those kind of like habits took me into college, where here I am trying to get a broadcasting degree and talk about sports and speaking up. Like when I would first like join in on a conversation, I almost like shocked myself, because I'm like, wow, I actually tried to have a conversation as a woman with a bunch of guys about sports. And I don't know if they took me seriously, but that was a big step for me to just kind of like open up and be more vocal about it. But it was tough, because it just felt like I wouldn't be accepted.
Has that feeling gotten better over time?
I think Twitter has been such it has been a blessing for me in terms of being able to kind of be myself. I can talk about sports, and then other people will connect with me and just talk about sports as well, and getting this like online, these online friends who kind of have the same interest. It started with Twitter, and then when I did the podcast, it kind of gave me more self-confidence, and like that I know what I'm talking about. And even though it feels like people are judging me for being a woman, if I might feel like that, I know I do my research. I know what I know, and I'm like, I know what I'm talking about. So it's just kind of helped me gain more self-confidence. And I think connecting with people who also share those same interests, it's made me feel better about opening up and talking about sports. And now it's just a part of me. People know me, like at my job, they know me as this girl who's obsessed with the Chicago Bears, and I'm more like, I own it. I am this person, and it's who I am, and it's just kind of how people define me sometimes. and I love it because it's like I can feel comfortable being myself and what I love to do. And so I think over the years I've gained that confidence, and it's because of this podcast. It's because of connecting with other fans.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And I hope that, when your daughter grows up, that she is able to just live in a world where she doesn't have to feel judged about liking sports.
Yeah, or just whatever. And it just like, I'm a very strong, independent woman. And so I want to give her those kind of values too, that whatever she wants to do, who cares if they say, oh, a man does that, or a man, like, I don't want her ever to feel like that. So whatever she wants to do, if she wants to be a big sports fan like me, I'm going to cheer her on, and kind of say like, no, this is okay. You can do whatever you want.
I feel like that's a really great place to end the podcast.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us. And our next episode, Cassidy and I, my other co-host, will be talking about our experiences with journalism, because we both study journalism. I didn't graduate with a journalism degree, but we both studied journalism in college. So
thank you for having me.